Tobias Reinhardt knelt in the snow and lifted the heavy metal lid, revealing 24 wrapped meat bundles, frozen solid in a box that stayed colder than any root cellar his neighbors had ever built. What happened during the winter of 1843, after his brother froze to death because their meat spoiled, would change how settlers preserved food across the entire northern frontier. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The winter of 1842 came early to the Dakota Territory. By late October, snow already covered the ground in a thick blanket that would not melt until April. Tobias Reinhardt and his younger brother Henrik had established their claim the previous spring, building a cabin and clearing enough land to plant a small crop. They had survived their first summer, harvested their grain, and prepared for winter with the confidence of men who believed hard work would see them through anything. Their preparation included food storage, specifically meat preservation. The brothers had hunted extensively throughout the fall, bringing down 2 elk, 3 deer, and numerous smaller game. The meat represented their primary protein source for the months ahead when hunting would become difficult or impossible. They had butchered carefully, cutting the meat into manageable portions, and stored everything in a root cellar they had dug behind their cabin. The root cellar was built following standard frontier practice. They had excavated a pit 8 feet deep and 6 feet square, lined it with logs to prevent collapse, and covered the top with thick planks overlaid with 2 feet of earth. The depth placed the storage chamber below the frost line, where temperature remained relatively constant throughout winter. In theory, the cellar would keep vegetables from freezing while maintaining cool enough conditions to preserve meat. Every experienced settler they had consulted before moving west had recommended this exact design. Tobias was 28 years old that winter. Henrik was 24. They were the sons of a Pennsylvania farmer who had taught them basic homesteading skills, but little about the extreme conditions of the northern frontier. Their father's root cellar in Pennsylvania had worked adequately for storing potatoes, turnips, and occasional meat. The brothers assumed the same design would function equally well in Dakota Territory. The assumption proved catastrophic. The first indication of trouble came in mid-January during an unusual warm spell. Air temperatures rose to 45 degrees for 3 consecutive days, melting the top layer of snow and creating mud where frozen ground had been. Inside the root cellar, the temperature rose above freezing. The carefully stored meat began to thaw. When the cold returned, as it inevitably did, the meat refroze. This cycle repeated itself twice more before February ended. Tobias noticed the problem but did not understand its full implications until it was too late. The repeated freeze-thaw cycles destroyed the meat's cellular structure. Each time ice crystals formed inside the muscle tissue, they expanded and ruptured cell walls. When the meat thawed, fluids leaked out. When it refroze, the damage compounded. By late February, the meat that had looked perfect in November showed obvious signs of deterioration. The surface had developed a grayish tint. Ice crystals formed irregular patterns across the cuts. The texture had changed from firm to somewhat mushy in places. Tobias examined the meat carefully during one of his trips down into the cellar. He held a piece of elk venison up to his lantern, studying the discoloration. The meat did not smell rotten exactly, but it lacked the clean, fresh scent of properly frozen game. He knew something was wrong, but faced an impossible choice. They had no other food source. The meat represented their survival through the remaining winter months. Throwing it away meant starvation. Henrik shared his brother's concerns, but argued they had little alternative. The nearest settlement was 4 days' travel through snow that often drifted waist-high. They could not hunt effectively in the deep winter conditions. Their grain supplies would not sustain them alone without protein. They would have to use the meat and hope for the best. The brothers began cooking every piece of meat thoroughly, hoping heat would kill anything dangerous. For several weeks, this approach seemed adequate. They ate elk stew, venison roasted over the fire, and small game prepared in their iron pot. Neither brother became seriously ill. Though both occasionally experienced mild stomach discomfort, they attributed to the monotonous diet. March arrived with temperatures that finally stabilized below freezing. The worst of the thaw cycles ended, but the damage to their meat supply was already done. Some pieces had deteriorated beyond any reasonable use. Tobias threw these away, bearing them far from the cabin to avoid attracting wolves or other predators. What remained looked marginally acceptable, though far from ideal. On March 7th, Henrik prepared their evening meal using elk meat from the cellar. He cooked it longer than usual, ensuring the center reached high temperature. They ate without incident and went to bed as darkness fell. Tobias woke several hours later to the sound of his brother vomiting violently outside the cabin. Henrik had stumbled out into the cold, too sick to remain inside. The illness progressed with terrifying speed. By morning, Henrik could not keep down even water. He developed a fever that left him shaking despite the blankets Tobias piled on him. Severe cramping doubled him over repeatedly. Tobias tried everything he knew: cool cloths for the fever, small sips of water, warmth from the fire. Nothing helped. Henrik weakened steadily throughout the day. By the second day, Henrik could barely speak. By the third day, he had stopped trying. On the morning of the fourth day, March 11, 1843, Henrik Reinhardt died in the cabin he had helped build, killed by meat that should have kept him alive. Tobias sat beside his brother's body for 6 hours, unable to move or think clearly. The fire burned low and eventually died, leaving the cabin cold. Outside, wind drove snow against the walls in gusts that created a sound like whispered warnings. Tobias finally stood when the cold became unbearable and rebuilt the fire. He covered Henrik's body with a blanket and sat staring at the flames until dawn. The ground was frozen solid. Digging a grave would require building a fire on the burial site and letting it burn for hours to thaw the earth enough to excavate. Tobias gathered wood throughout the morning, moving mechanically, his mind numb. He selected a spot 30 yards from the cabin on a small rise where the snow was not as deep. He built a large fire and kept it burning throughout the day and into the night. By the following morning, the ground had thawed enough to dig. Tobias used a pick to break through the remaining frozen layer, then switched to a shovel. The work took most of the day. He dug until the hole was deep enough, then returned to the cabin. He wrapped Henrik's body in the blanket and carried his brother to the grave. There was no one to say words over the burial. Tobias stood silently for several minutes, then filled the grave and marked it with stones he gathered from the nearby creek bed. He returned to the cabin as darkness fell. The root cellar still contained meat. Tobias went down with a lantern and looked at the remaining supplies. He picked up a piece of venison and examined it in the light. The meat had killed his brother. The meat that was supposed to sustain them through winter had become poison. He carried every piece up from the cellar and threw it all into the snow far from the cabin. That night, Tobias sat at the rough table he and Henrik had built together and forced himself to think clearly. He had grain enough to survive until spring if he was careful. He could supplement with small game if he could trap successfully. He would not starve, but the question that consumed him was not about his immediate survival. The question was why the meat had failed. Root cellars worked. Settlers across the frontier used them successfully. His father had used one in Pennsylvania for years. But something about this climate, this particular winter, had made the design inadequate. Tobias thought about the thaw cycles, the temperature fluctuations, the way the meat had frozen and thawed repeatedly. Root cellars were designed to stay above freezing. That was their purpose for vegetable storage. But meat needed different conditions. Meat needed to stay frozen, not cool, not cold, frozen solid without interruption. Root cellars could not provide that. Stability, Tobias realized his brother had died because they had used the wrong storage method for the wrong climate. And that realization, born from grief and guilt, would not leave him alone. Spring came slowly to the Dakota territory. Snow melted in uneven patches, revealing brown grass and muddy ground. Tobias planted his crop and tended it with the same mechanical efficiency he applied to all tasks that season. His mind was elsewhere. Every spare moment he thought about food preservation and the problem that had killed Henrik. He returned to the root cellar repeatedly, studying its construction. The design was sound for its intended purpose. 8 feet of depth provided insulation from extreme temperature swings. The earth surrounding the chamber maintained relatively stable conditions. For storing vegetables that needed protection from freezing, the cellar worked perfectly. But for meat requiring genuine frozen storage, the design had a fundamental flaw. It could not maintain consistent sub-zero temperatures. Tobias observed that air temperature on the surface fluctuated wildly throughout winter. A warm spell could push temperatures above freezing for days. These fluctuations penetrated into the root cellar, causing the deadly thaw cycles. What he needed was storage that stayed frozen regardless of surface conditions. He began paying attention to how different materials and locations maintained cold. He noticed that snow-covered objects stayed frozen even during warm spells. A piece of firewood buried in a snowbank in January would still be frozen solid in March, even after several thaws. The snow itself provided insulation, but it did something more. It trapped cold in a way Earth did not. Tobias began a series of simple experiments. He buried meat scraps in snow at various depths and locations. He checked them after warm spells. The results were consistent. Snow-buried items maintained frozen temperatures far better than items stored in his root cellar, but simply burying meat in snow presented obvious problems. Retrieval would require digging through potentially several feet of packed snow every time he needed food. Animals could dig up buried meat. There was no organization or protection. Tobias needed a system that combined snow's superior insulation properties with practical accessibility and security. He spent hours sketching ideas on a piece of slate he kept in the cabin, a box at ground level surrounded by snow. But how to maintain the snow throughout winter? How to keep it compressed and functional? How to access the box without destroying the insulation? The questions multiplied, but Tobias kept working through them methodically. In late spring, Tobias traveled to a settlement 60 miles south to purchase supplies. While there, he visited an abandoned mining camp and found scattered equipment including a large rectangular piece of steel plate, approximately 3 feet by 2 feet. The metal was heavy, perhaps 40 pounds, with a small handle welded to one edge. It had apparently served as a furnace door or covering. Tobias studied the metal plate for a long time. Heavy metal would conduct cold from the surrounding snow. A metal lid would stay cold even when exposed to air. Weight would create a seal without complicated hinges or latches that could freeze and fail. He purchased the metal plate and hauled it back to his claim. Summer work consumed most of Tobias's time, but he continued thinking about his storage system. In early July, he decided to explore the surrounding area more thoroughly, looking for anything that might inform his design. 5 miles west of his claim, he found the remains of an abandoned homestead. The cabin had partially collapsed, its roof caved in from snow weight during some previous winter. The property had clearly been deserted for at least 2 years, based on the vegetation growing through the floorboards. Tobias knew the story vaguely. A settler named Jakob Brenner had claimed this land in 1839, survived 2 winters, then abandoned the property and returned east. Other settlers attributed his departure to loneliness or poor land quality. But as Tobias explored the ruins, he found evidence of something else. Behind the collapsed cabin, Brenner had dug a root cellar similar to the one Tobias and Henrik had built. The cellar had partially caved in, and Tobias climbed down carefully to examine it. Inside, he found the remnants of food storage, broken crocks, rotted wooden containers, and scattered bones from butchered animals. The quantity of bones suggested Brenner had stored significant meat, but something had clearly gone wrong. More interesting were marks carved into the logs lining the cellar walls. Brenner had apparently used a knife to scratch notes directly into the wood. Most were simple tallies or dates, but one section contained actual observations. The carving was crude but legible. December warm spell, 3 days cellar temp rises, meat thaws, read one line. Below it, January thaw again, meat spoils faster than snow buried. And finally, snow keeps colder than earth, why? Tobias stood in the abandoned cellar reading these words with growing excitement. Brenner had encountered the exact same problem. He had made the same observations about snow's superior cold retention. He had asked the same question about why snow worked better than earth. But apparently, Brenner had never developed a solution. He had simply given up and left. Tobias climbed out of the cellar and searched the rest of the property. He found more evidence of Brenner's struggles. Near the tree line, several large holes had been dug and then filled in, as if Brenner had experimented with different storage locations. One hole was much shallower than a typical root cellar, only 3 feet deep. Another had been dug near a natural depression where snow would accumulate heavily. Brenner had been testing ideas, but apparently never found an answer that worked. Inside the collapsed cabin, Tobias found one more carving on the wall near where the fireplace had stood. Just 3 words scratched deep into the log. Snow is answer. Brenner had identified the solution, but lacked either the time, resources, or determination to implement it properly. Tobias stood looking at those words for a long time. Brenner had failed, but his observations were valuable. Tobias would succeed where Brenner had not. Throughout the summer and fall of 1843, Tobias refined his design. The core concept was simple, but required careful planning. A wooden box built at ground level would serve as the storage chamber. Compressed snow packed around the box would provide insulation. The heavy metal lid would seal the top and conduct exterior cold into the interior. Meat wrapped in protective material would prevent contamination and freezer burn. The execution required solving several technical challenges. The box needed to be large enough to hold significant quantities of meat, but small enough that surrounding snow could provide adequate insulation. Tobias settled on dimensions of 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2 feet deep. This size would hold enough meat for an entire winter while remaining manageable for one person to load and access. He selected thick planks from pine trees he had felled earlier in the year. Each plank was shaped to uniform thickness using a draw knife, creating tight fits between boards. The corners would be reinforced with iron brackets to prevent the box from shifting or separating under the weight of snow and frozen meat. He spent 3 weeks building the box with the same obsessive attention to detail that characterized all his work that year. The meat wrapping system emerged from experimentation. Tobias knew that meat exposed directly to frozen air would suffer freezer burn, a process where ice sublimated directly from the meat's surface, leaving it dried and discolored. He needed a barrier that would allow the meat to freeze solid while protecting the surface. He tested various materials, simple cloth, leather scraps, and cloth soaked in melted tallow. The tallow-soaked cloth proved most effective. When frozen, it created a waxy barrier that sealed completely around each meat portion. His neighbor Martin Schuler visited in late October and watched Tobias prepare his wrapping materials. Schuler was a practical man who had survived 5 winters in the territory using traditional methods. He looked at the careful wrapping process and shook his head. "You are wasting tallow that could be used for candles or soap," Schuler said. "Meat freezes just fine without all this fussing." Tobias continued working without arguing. He had learned that explaining his reasoning to skeptics was futile. Schuler also questioned the metal lid, which Tobias had cleaned and positioned near his cabin. "That piece of steel is heavy as sin and serves no purpose a wooden cover could not handle. "Better," Schuller observed. "Metal will just make your hands cold when you need to open it." Tobias simply nodded and thanked Schuller for his concern. He knew the metal's thermal conductivity was an advantage, not a drawback. The metal would stay as cold as the surrounding snow, helping maintain stable interior temperatures. Its weight would create a seal without hinges or latches that could freeze shut. But explaining thermal principles to Schuller would accomplish nothing except create more argument. By early November, everything was ready. Tobias just needed snow. The first significant snowfall came on November 12th. 6 inches fell overnight, and Tobias knew more would follow. He had already selected the location for his snowbox, a spot 30 yards from his cabin on the north side where the structure would remain shaded throughout winter. Shade was critical. Direct sunlight, even in winter, could warm surfaces enough to cause problems. He dug a shallow depression in the ground, removing soil to a depth of 6 inches. This would anchor the box and provide drainage if any melting occurred. He positioned the wooden box in the depression and ensured it sat level. Then he waited for more snow. Over the next week, another foot accumulated. Tobias began the careful process of packing snow around the box. This was not simply piling snow haphazardly. He worked methodically, adding snow in layers and compressing each layer by stomping it firmly with his boots and packing it with a wooden paddle he had made for this purpose. Compressed snow eliminated air pockets and created much better insulation than loose snow. He built the snow walls to a thickness of 18 inches on all sides. The compressed snow was dense enough to support its own weight and formed a rigid structure around the wooden box. The top remained open, allowing access to the interior. He positioned the metal lid over the opening and tested how it fit. The lid covered the box completely with a slight overhang, and its weight held it firmly in place. Now came the critical testing phase. Tobias had hunted a deer the previous week and had butchered it specifically for this experiment. He wrapped individual portions in his tallow-soaked cloth, tying each bundle securely. He placed half the meat in the snowbox and arranged the pieces so they did not touch each other initially. This would allow cold to penetrate each piece from all sides. Once frozen, he could stack them more tightly. The other half of the deer meat he stored in his root cellar using traditional methods. This would serve as his control. If the snowbox failed, he would still have backup supplies. If both systems failed, he would face the same crisis that had killed Henrik. But Tobias was confident enough in his observations to risk the test. He monitored both storage locations obsessively over the following weeks. He used a simple temperature test, a small container of water placed in each location. In the root cellar, the water stayed liquid, indicating temperatures above 32 degrees. In the snowbox, the water froze solid within hours and remained frozen. December brought a warm spell. Temperatures rose to 40 degrees for 2 days. In the root cellar, Tobias noticed condensation on the walls. The meat showed signs of surface thawing. In the snowbox, everything remained frozen solid. The thick, compressed snow walls had insulated the interior completely. The metal lid, despite being exposed to warm air, had stayed cold from contact with the snow. Winter settled over the Dakota territory with the grinding certainty of a millstone. Snow fell regularly throughout December and January, adding to the accumulated depth. Tobias maintained his snowbox carefully, adding fresh snow when needed and recompressing the walls if they showed any signs of settling or melting. The work was minimal compared to the constant worry that had accompanied his root cellar the previous year. The system worked flawlessly. Tobias had hunted successfully in early winter, bringing down an elk and 2 more deer before the deep cold made hunting impractical. He butchered each animal carefully, wrapped every portion in his tallow-soaked cloth, and stored everything in the snowbox. The organized arrangement allowed him to retrieve specific cuts without disturbing the entire supply. He could lift the metal lid, remove what he needed, and close everything back up in less than 2 minutes. The metal lid never froze shut. Its weight kept it firmly in place against wind, but Tobias could lift it easily using the small handle. Snow that accumulated on top of the lid actually helped, adding another layer of insulation. He simply brushed off excess snow when he needed access, and the system remained perfectly functional. Interior temperatures stayed consistent regardless of exterior conditions, even during a particularly severe warm spell in late January when air temperatures rose to 48 degrees and remained there for 4 days. The snowbox interior stayed frozen. Tobias tested this by checking the meat. Every piece was rock solid, with no signs of surface thawing or deterioration. The compressed snow walls, nearly 2 feet thick, had protected the frozen chamber completely. By contrast, his root cellar showed the same problems as the previous year. Temperature fluctuations caused repeated freeze-thaw cycles. The vegetables he had stored there survived adequately because they could tolerate some temperature variation. But he had placed one wrapped piece of meat in the cellar as an ongoing comparison. By February, that piece showed obvious deterioration, surface discoloration, ice crystal formation, and texture changes. The piece was still technically edible if cooked thoroughly, but it bore no resemblance to the pristine meat in his snowbox. February brought the coldest temperatures of the winter. For 2 weeks, the air temperature never rose above zero, brutal cold that would have made a root cellar nearly inaccessible and potentially dangerous to enter. But Tobias simply walked to his snowbox, lifted the lid, retrieved his meat, and returned to the cabin. The snowbox remained accessible and functional regardless of temperature extremes. Martin Schuler visited in mid-February and noticed Tobias's excellent condition. "You are looking well fed for a man living alone through this winter," Schuler observed. Tobias offered him a meal, preparing elk steaks from his snowbox supply. The meat was perfect, no off flavors, no discoloration, the texture firm and clean. Schuler ate with obvious appreciation, then asked where Tobias had obtained such high-quality meat so late in winter. Tobias walked Schuler outside and showed him the snowbox. He lifted the metal lid, revealing the organized rows of wrapped meat bundles, all frozen solid. Schuler stared in silence for a long moment, then asked how it worked. Tobias explained the compressed snow insulation, the metal lid, the wrapping system. Schuler listened carefully but said nothing more. He left shortly afterward, still processing what he had seen. On February 23rd, a man appeared at Tobias's cabin in desperate condition. Wilhelm Frost was a traveling trapper who worked a circuit through the northern territories, staying at various camps and cabins throughout winter. Tobias had met him briefly the previous year, but did not know him well. The man who stood at his door now looked half-starved and exhausted. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had clearly lost significant weight. His face was gaunt, his movements weak. Tobias brought him inside immediately and sat him near the fire. Frost explained his situation in a voice barely above a whisper. He had been working trap lines 40 miles north, staying in a small cabin he had built years earlier. His food supplies had been stored in a traditional cache, a platform built high in trees to keep it away from bears and other animals. The cache had worked adequately in previous years, but this winter's extreme temperature fluctuations had destroyed his meat supply. The freeze-thaw cycles had caused the same spoilage Tobias knew too well. Frost had been eating the questionable meat out of necessity, becoming increasingly ill, but having no alternative. 2 weeks earlier, he had finally accepted that his remaining supplies were too dangerous to consume. He had abandoned his trap lines and started south toward the nearest settlement, hoping to reach it before starvation took him. Tobias's cabin had appeared just as Frost was reaching the limit of his endurance. Tobias prepared food immediately. He went to his snowbox, retrieved wrapped elk meat, and cooked it thoroughly. Frost ate slowly, his shrunken stomach unable to handle large quantities. Over the next hour, as warmth and food began to restore him, Frost asked where Tobias had obtained meat in such perfect condition this late in winter. His own supplies had failed by early January. How had Tobias maintained quality for nearly 2 additional months? Tobias explained his system. He described Henrik's death, the observations about snow's superior cold retention, the design process, and the construction of the snowbox. Frost listened with the intense focus of a man hearing information that could save his life in future winters. When Tobias finished, Frost asked to see the system directly. They went outside to the snowbox. Tobias lifted the metal lid and showed Frost the interior, 24 wrapped bundles still frozen solid despite weeks of storage. Frost examined everything carefully. He touched the compressed snow walls, noting their density and thickness. He lifted the metal lid himself, feeling its weight and how it sealed. He asked detailed questions about the wrapping technique, the box dimensions, and the maintenance required. "This is remarkable," Frost said finally. "I have seen root cellars, smokehouses, and elevated caches across hundreds of miles of territory. I have never seen anything like this. You have solved a problem that kills trappers and settlers every winter." Tobias shrugged. "It works for me. Whether it would work elsewhere, I cannot say." Frost stayed 3 days, regaining strength. When he left, he carried enough of Tobias's meat to reach the settlement safely. He also carried detailed knowledge of a preservation system that would soon spread through the northern trapping network, saving lives in ways Tobias would never fully know. Wilhelm Frost proved to be a man of his word and a natural communicator. Throughout the spring and summer of 1844, he traveled his trapping circuit and spoke about what he had seen at Tobias Reinhardt's cabin. He described the snowbox in detail to other trappers, settlers, and traders he encountered. Some dismissed the idea as too elaborate. Others listened with interest, recognizing the potential value. By fall of 1844, at least 6 men had built variations of Tobias's system at their own claims. The modifications were diverse, but the core principles remained consistent. Some trappers used flat stones instead of metal lids, selecting pieces that were naturally heavy and smooth. Others built larger boxes to accommodate bigger meat supplies. A few experimented with different wrapping materials, though most adopted Tobias's tallow-soaked cloth method after finding it most effective. One innovative trapper built multiple smaller boxes instead of one large one, reasoning that separate storage would prevent total loss if one cache somehow failed. By 1846, the technique had spread throughout the northern Dakota and Montana territories. Settlers building new homesteads often constructed snow boxes before building root cellars, prioritizing meat preservation over vegetable storage. The systems acquired various names depending on location: frozen boxes, snow caches, winter vaults. But trappers and traders who knew the origin simply called them Reinhardt boxes, a name that persisted in oral tradition even as the inventor's actual identity faded from memory. Tobias himself never promoted his innovation or sought recognition. He continued working his claim, maintaining his cabin, and living quietly. In the fall of 1847, a woman named Catherine Mueller arrived at the settlement 60 miles south, recently widowed and looking to join family members who had moved west. Tobias met her during one of his supply trips. They married that winter, and Catherine moved to the cabin that Tobias had once shared with Henrik. Catherine proved to be practical and resourceful. She quickly understood the snow box system and helped Tobias maintain it throughout subsequent winters. They lived simply but comfortably, never wealthy but never desperate. The snow box provided reliable meat preservation year after year. In 1851, Catherine gave birth to a daughter they named Anna. 2 more children followed in 1853 and 1856. The family prospered modestly. Tobias expanded his cabin, added livestock, and improved his land. He never spoke much about Henrik or the winter that had changed everything. Catherine knew the story but understood that her husband preferred to leave the past undisturbed. The grave on the hillside was tended carefully each spring, the stones reset if winter had shifted them, but Tobias rarely visited otherwise. In 1868, Tobias fell ill with pneumonia. He died on March 18th at age 54, surrounded by his family in the cabin he had built 26 years earlier. He was buried next to Henrik on the hillside, the two brothers reunited in death, as they had been separated by tragedy in life. Catherine and the children continued working the claim for several more years before eventually moving to a larger settlement where the children could attend school. The snowbox remained functional for another decade, used by subsequent owners of the property.